All right, everybody, how you doing? Hopefully, you are having a fun time being home from all of this COVID-19 nonsense. In today's video, we'll go through the cardiovascular system pretty briefly here, and I am joined by my brother-in-law, who is a doctor, Dr. Kenny Abner. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, nice to meet you guys. And
Yeah, there you go.
there-
And he'll kind of help us out here as we go through the cardiovascular system. You should have ideally looked at some of the other things already. There were a couple assignments on Khan Academy and all these other things. This should kind of be a nice big overview of all the stuff you already looked at. So there's that. And there's a lot of slides here. We're definitely not going to look at all of them, but they will be linked down below, and they'll be available for you to download. Or if you're not in my class and you just know about the cardiovascular system for whatever reason, they are there as well. So there you go. Oh, we have on the thing. Okay, so with the cardiovascular system, this is really a combination of two different things as far as what this term actually means. The heart is involved with this, the lungs are involved with this, and the main function is to transport things throughout your body, mainly using the blood, which we'll talk about next week. Kenny?
Cardiovascular system. Main components would be the heart, lungs, and obviously by them. Even in disease, the lungs are heart problem closely linked. It's not really just the heart on
Right.
highlights.
Well, okay. So the main thing that we really think about when we think about the heart is how oxygen is transported throughout the body, but obviously there is more than that. Nutrients, cell waste, hormones, anything else that your body needs to maintain homeostasis, which, if you recall, is that balance your body's always trying to be in. So there's that. And what the heart is actually doing is it's acting as a pump to move all this blood throughout your body. If you recall when we talked about glycolysis and all of that fun stuff way back earlier, you know how you eat food with sugar in it and then it gets to your cells and cellular respiration happens to make ATP. Well, that process is kind of the blood carries all of that stuff that you eat to your cells and removes all the waste and all of that. So that's all part of your cardiovascular system.
Yeah, blood is like highway in a
Exactly.
lot of ways.
Exactly. So here's a general picture of the heart. Obviously, this is colorized and labeled and all of that. But as far as size, if you were to make a closed fist with your hand, either one, right? That's approximately how big your heart actually is. Weighs a little bit less than a pound. It's enclosed with a bunch of other stuff, right? And it's just kind of sandwiched right in between both lungs. We're not going to cover too much about all the different layers on the outside, but that's kind of what some of these slides are indicating here with the pericardium and all of that. So we'll go ahead and skip through these right here. Hope you don't mind. They are linked down below, not in the comments. The thing, below a YouTube video. And here's kind of where we'll pick up with this. You can really break the heart down into 4 different sections. And on the top 2 sections of the heart, you have what are called the atria, or atrium for plural, one of those. And at the bottom, you have the ventricles. And there's a specific pathway that blood takes through the heart. And usually what happens is the atria receive blood, whether it's coming from the body or coming from the lungs, depending on what side of the heart we're talking about. And the ventricles are what's going to pump the blood wherever it needs to go, whether to the body or to the lungs. You may have noticed here, if you're looking at this diagram, the left side of the diagram is labeled as the right side of the heart, and the right side of the diagram is labeled as the left side of the heart. Dr. Kenny, would you like to give us some explanation as to why?
Yeah, so right side of the heart, we have the right. Very important. Blood comes in. Obviously, we'll talk about side of the heart, and then body will get side of the heart. But the left side is obviously much muscular. I am sure. With the H, around the ventricular walls. You can see them obviously
Right
thick.
here.
Um, that's because, as you'll discuss, early, but behind that, by the then the ventricles one, and then left side is much.
True, true. And so this is what you would see as if you were looking at a specific individual, right? Someone that was facing you.
Right.
So that's why the labels are seemingly flipped, right? There's been horror stories in medicine of doctors operating on, say, like the right knee when the left knee was actually the one that's an issue, right? Because it's always from the perspective of whoever you're looking at, not the perspective that you are actually looking through, right? So that's some brief context here behind this diagram. Anything else to add here?
I didn't
All
even
right.
answer the
Oh no, I suppose not.
question.
But in any case, yeah. So here's kind of here's the pathway. We'll kind of follow the arrows here. Um, Blood will initially enter the right atrium, and so it'll drain from the top part of your body and the bottom part of your body through the vena cavas, right? And so blood will fill up in the right atrium, and then the blood will go ahead and move through to the right ventricle, in which case, well, there's a small contraction here on the top, really, but part of your heartbeat is these ventricles contracting, right? And that's going to push the blood on through the pulmonary artery, and that's going to go to the lungs. Blood from the lungs will then return through the pulmonary vein, and it'll enter the left side of the heart into the left atrium, move down into the left ventricle. Another pump from the ventricles will push that blood on through to the rest of your body through the aorta. It'll go up and it'll go down to your body as well, wherever the blood really needs to go. Important note here is that this is all happening simultaneously, as in when blood's coming into the right atrium, right, and then eventually to the right ventricle, when that contracts and blood from the right ventricle goes to the lungs, blood is simultaneously leaving the left ventricle and going through the aorta to the rest of the body, right? So it's not that one of these chambers is working at a time, but rather a lot of these things are happening at the same time here.
Yeah, and then like I was saying, left ventricle not as well highlighted. Left ventricle muscles all the body. It feeds the heart itself. The rest of the body. Whereas the right ventricle, blood to the lung, top of each other. That's what I was getting at. Obviously, atria only pump the ventricle, so there is a very not much. So the anatomy and function are
Right, right. So yeah, that's kind of the pathway that blood will take throughout the body. And in general, the ventricles are quite thick, as Dr. Kenny had alluded to, and they act to pump the blood, right? And so that's what kind of keeps everything in circulation. We'll go ahead and move through some of these things. So okay, the heart functions as a double pump. What's that? What that is referring to is that the top part of the heart can contract and the bottom part of the heart can contract. And so the goal is to take all the blood from the body that does not have oxygen anymore, as in that oxygen has already been removed from the blood. That blood has circulated throughout the body. And as you know, all of your cells need oxygen. So that oxygen has been used up. Now it's full of carbon dioxide because those are waste products that your cells are making, right? And so the goal is that your heart can help the blood in exchanging all of those gases. And the way that happens is that blood has to circulate through the lungs and then back. And so the heart is really the way to really make all of that happen. Right? Oh, it's just another. The different valves and stuff like that, we don't really have to worry about too much. But in general, it's well, okay, I guess it depends what you're studying, right? But for our purposes here, we don't really have to worry about the different valves, and all of that. But obviously, if you were going into nursing or some sort of profession like that, you would know all of these parts. Oh, pulmonary circulation. Dr. Kenny?
Yeah, it sounds. So the cardiovascular system, first of all, is kind of split into arteries and And arteries oxygen blood from the lungs. So, the aorta is a giant artery. Obviously, that out of the left ventricle, blood that just came from the lungs, newly oxygenated blood, right? So, I guess we would call it left side of the heart, the left hemisphere, rest of the body has oxygenated blood, and as we just talked about, it goes blood being a highway, it has all that cargo, that oxygen, blood. Um, Drives down to the cells and delivers it. It returns in the right side of that heart, is now out, and sent to the lungs, that pulmonary artery. Oxygen. The pulmonary circulation, what that's referred, specifically the artery coming off of the right ventricle, going to getting on right back to the heart via returning into left atrium. So that is a circle if you think right atrium, pulmonary circuit, pulmonary circuit. How we reoxygenate. Drives the pulmonary circuit pretty well. Probably for
Yeah, I would say that's pretty good. An interesting kind of thing to note here. When I had originally learned all of this stuff, we learned that arteries are blood vessels that carry oxygenated blood, and veins are blood vessels that carry deoxygenated blood. And the exception to that was always this pulmonary circuit, because there's a situation here in which case blood from the what is this? The right ventricle is leaving through the pulmonary arteries, but yet it's deoxygenated blood, right? So it doesn't quite fit the old definition of what an artery was and the old definition of what a vein was. But now, again, Dr. Kenny, correct me if things have been updated further from my knowledge here. But an artery is any blood vessel carrying blood away from the heart, which is why this pulmonary artery here, carrying deoxygenated blood away. And a vein is any kind of blood vessel carrying blood to the heart. Is that an accurate way to describe?
That is the artery that carries the heart. But as you said, traditionally, arteries are oxygenated.
Right. So I remember very vividly having to answer that on an exam and put this particular exception of like, oh, but except in the pulmonary circulation, that's not the case anymore. So there's that. Fun facts for you. And I suppose this would have been a better diagram to actually, go over. But in any case, there's that. So as we mentioned, blood is returned to the heart and then eventually leaves through the aorta. And the aorta is this big blood vessel. Is it the biggest blood vessel in the body?
It's the thickest
yeah.
And has plastic tissue. It's like I've actually described it. It's like really thick. Not plastic, but stretchy material.
Right.
I don't know.
Right.
That elastic.
Right. And so it's a big blood vessel, obviously, and it's branched into obviously there's some branches that go north, right? If we think of it that way, and those obviously go to your brain. And part of it goes south as well to hit the rest of your body. All of that is important. So we already talked about how the oxygen poor blood or deoxygenated blood circles on back. So not really going to worry about that here. And this whole part of returning the deoxygenated blood forms what's called the systemic circuit, which Dr. Kenny had alluded to earlier. And so this is really what the rest of your body is worried about, right? Whereas in your pulmonary circuit, that's just how the blood is getting from the heart to the lungs and back. Systemic circulation is blood moving from your heart to your body and back. Okay. And of course, I don't think we need to really go into detail as to why that oxygen is important for your body. So again, as was mentioned earlier, the left side of your heart is generally more powerful. Your heart is more or less in the center of your chest, but it definitely sticks out in one direction compared to the other, and that's because the left ventricle is just so much more muscular. That's because if you think about where does the right ventricle actually have to pump, no more than what 5 inches.
Right ventricle. Yeah,
Yeah,
no, it's
it's
very
right
short,
there. Yeah,
very short
right.
inches.
Your lungs are right there. Whereas the left ventricle, once this contracts, it's got to be strong enough to push blood all the way down to your toes, all the way up to your brain, right? So this muscle is much more swole, right?
Very much more.
Much more swole,
Oh,
right? Doesn't skip leg day.
no.
It's huge, right? Got the gains. So okay, not gonna worry about the valves too much, other than the function of these valves is to prevent backflow, meaning once blood enters the right ventricle, you don't want it going back to the right atrium, right? Once blood enters the left ventricle, you don't want it going back to the left atrium. There's certain medical issues that does actually occur, but in general, that's what those valves are for.
Yeah, no, that's something. Well, and obviously, some example just for an interest. That's something we would call valvular. With traditional heart failure, heart attacks, and the heart itself dies, the valves are so malfunctioning so bad, the heart can't properly inject enough blood into the body. A similar condition to having repeated myocardial infarctions or heart attack, hearts dying. So valves are important.
Right. So we'll go ahead and go on through these. Again, we're not gonna worry too much about some of these particular things. Let me make sure we're not missing anything important. Heart attacks are not good.
Very bad.
Right.
Generally,
Generally, heart attacks are bad.
try to avoid them. I
Yeah,
think if
try
you
to
could.
if you can. Yeah. So in general, your heart pumps so much blood throughout your lifetime, but um, per day, your heart will contract about 1,000 times, and it's your body has about a 6 quart supply of blood. Those of you not familiar with that unit, that's like what 2 liters of Coke.
Yeah, a quart.
It's not that much. Yeah, it's not all that much.
Less than you
Um,
think.
right. It's less than you think. Um, so there's that. And in a single day, your heart will pump through 6,000 quarts of blood.
So
Obviously, this number repeated throughout
yeah,
the whole
I
day,
think
right?
there's 4 quarts. That's 1.5, which is like 3.
Yeah. So a
Yeah,
little, but okay. So a 2 liter of Coke and a half.
and a half or so.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Really,
yeah,
I guess we should have Googled this
yeah,
beforehand,
probably.
right? But
Not
yeah,
mathematicians here.
but it's not a lot of blood. That's kind of the point here, right? Um, do we want to mention this? Yeah, we do want to mention this. Um, the cells of the heart are a specific kind of cell, right? It's not the same as a skin cell or anything like that. These cells have way more mitochondria than other cells, and so you would call these cardiac cells, specifically indicating these belong to the heart, and they can contract spontaneously and independently from the nervous system, right? So there's that, and in fact, the heart has its own electrical system as to what actually causes it to contract, which we'll talk about in a moment. But it's important to note that even if you remove connections from the nervous system, which we'll talk about in bloods next week, and I think muscles after that, and then maybe nervous system. But in any case, we'll see more of that later as well. Um, Let me think. Okay. So here's kind of if you think about the heart as an electrical diagram, as in where a cable is plugged into and where power's coming from and all of that, this is kind of what it looks like. Um, your heartbeat starts at what's called the SA node, which I used to remember what it stood for. Uh,
Mhm.
but I can no longer. But this is referred to as the pacemaker of the heart. And this is what kind of kicks off the heartbeat in general. Usually, when people go in for procedures and they get a pacemaker, right, to control their heartbeat, what would have happened for that particular individual is there something going on with the SA node, or some external device needs to kind of indicate to the SA node, hey, it's time to start the
Fire,
heartbeat.
yeah.
Yeah, kind of like, I guess if I can take it back to a sports analogy, if you're in a loud stadium, right, and you're like a football player, right, and you need to move to like a silent snap count, right, because the offense needs to all go at the same time, right. That could be the guard tapping the center and the center snapping the ball, right. That's kind of your pacemaker and SA node. That electrical signal leaves the SA node, goes to your AV node, which is kind of sandwiched between the ventricles and the atria, specifically more on the right side here, and then moves on down, and then hits what are called the Purkinje fibers, which is, of course, named after the scientist who investigated this. And that electrical signal causes the ventricles to squeeze or to contract, and that in turn, obviously, if you squeeze it and the valve back to the atria is closed, right, you're gonna force the blood out of the heart. Whether on the right side you're going to the lungs, on the left side you're going to the right.
Yeah, so that's saying kind of
There you
not
go.
really important, but just
Yeah, I
and
used to know that. Yeah.
those are nerves. Cells would be nerves. Different than cardiac. I don't know how much you learned about cell special, but what the previous slide I was talking about was that severed, but the cardiac cells themselves are capable of generating a flow rate. Probably not enough to body, but even without a nervous input, that synoatrial node, that nerve is completely cardiac.
Yeah.
Kind of a cool safety mechanism.
Yes. Um. So in any case, here's kind of a big explanation of everything that we just kind of went through. On that, and that's kind of a pretty decent overview of the heart in general, in terms of the circulation and electrical side and all of that. Um, the last thing we really want to talk about is depolarization and repolarization and how that affects. Obviously, everyone has seen that EKG kind of line, right? With the I'm drawing it with my hand right now, but obviously you can't see that, right? But that's directly related to what we just talked about with the SA node and all of that. And so when an electrical signal actually triggers something happening in your heart, you'll see it on an EKG line, right? And I don't know if we actually have a slide of this. Oh, we do. Okay. So actually, do we have a bigger one? Probably not. But we'll go back to this one. But in any case, if we were to look at, none of these are good.
Got some pretty good arrhythmias here. Atrial
Yeah,
flutter.
yeah, you got some interesting stuff here. All right, so we're looking at a typical EKG signal. That stands for electrocardiogram, right? And ignore the fact that an EKG, obviously cardio starts with a C. But there's that, right? Um, yeah, at least when I learned it, EKG and ECG were two different things. But my understanding is that may have changed. But in any case, here is an EKG wave, right? Or what would you call this?
So yeah, this I would call this kind of a QR. Yeah, what you can, you have like waves, RS complex and it's which
Right.
typically that's what a normal EKG form.
Right. So, if you ever went to a hospital for whatever reason, or if you ever took an EKG of yourself or had seen an EKG, this is kind of what you would see in a healthy person, right?
Yeah, I guess this is what I would call a normal waveform.
Right. So, what we're actually looking at is all the electrical activity that's happening in the heart throughout what you would consider to be a regular heartbeat, right? The big thing that'll jump out to you is this big spike. See it again here because we have two different complexes here. But this is called a QRS.
Complex.
Right.
And that in particular is obviously the line, which is what we would call kind of neutrality. And as you go up on the page, positive, that's all not important. But this is ventricular depolarization. Remember, in the heartbeat, ventricle is the biggest part of the heart. This is ventricular depolarization, which could make sense because it's the waveform on the that aligns with.
So that means when you see this big kind of spike on an EKG, that means the ventricle is doing its job. You'll see two smaller waveforms on either side.
Mm-hmm.
The P wave is atrial depolarization, right?
That's right.
So kind of the same idea as the QRS, except instead of the ventricles, we're talking about the atria.
Mm-hmm. Smaller, there's less tissue, not as big as a.
Right, and remember, how far does the atria have to pump blood? Well, it really doesn't have to pump at all, right? It just kind of travels into the ventricle. So this is a relatively small amount of electrical signal that's actually needed for that to happen. And whenever something depolarizes, in order for it to be ready to go for the next heartbeat, it has to repolarize. So that's exactly what you see in this T wave. This is the ventricles basically resetting electrically, right?
Yeah.
In order to do the next subsequent QRS. Big wave here. And if you're curious, okay, well, if the ventricles had to repolarize, and here's your T wave, why didn't the atria have to repolarize? And the answer is, well, they did, right? And the atria happened to repolarize at the same time as the QRS. The reason we don't see this on an EKG is because, well, there's a huge electrical spike when the ventricles contract, and so the atrial repolarization is kind of snuck in here. It's somewhere in this signal. It's happening simultaneously. But this situation kind of repeats ad infinitum throughout your life. It doesn't really stop, or at least it should sure. I sure hope it doesn't. Right? That would be very bad. So this is your heartbeat, obviously. And if you're ever watching Grey's Anatomy or any medical related show and you hear that solid tone during a flatline, that's because the medical system that monitors this is not detecting this kind of waveform, which is your heart actually contracting. And obviously, if your heart is not contracting, that means your body is not circulating oxygen, right, to all your cells, which means your cells are not creating ATP, which means you can't do anything that actually requires energy. And
can't move your diaphragm.
Right, can't breathe. And well, your heart actually needs ATP as well, right?
That's right.
So all kinds of issues when this isn't looking right. This can look a bunch of different ways depending on different medical conditions. I remember when I got my EKG license, right, to do this as a job. Depending on the condition, these waveforms can really look pretty wacky, and you can have P waves and T waves that are almost not there, right? And you can have QRS complexes that are dipped way below, and you can have some pretty wacky stuff. Um, as well, if you have irregular heartbeats, this can look a little bit different. But in general, this is kind of a big overview of electrical signal. Dr. Kenny, anything to add?
Very cool. And this think through what's happening with your heartbeat. Followed by atrial ventricular polarization followed by ventricular contraction. Same way we could talk about the electrical system, intervenous fibers. You SA node right by the P wave, and then that's right by the QRS. Well, you can imagine this on the AV node, and then going to the Purkinje fibers, and that's right after that it would repolarize. So you might have ventricular traction right in this kind of follow it that way. People who have like heart blocks, we call it heart blocks. What it essentially is really the SA node or the AV not working properly. You can get these widening of the PR to draw. I guess we doesn't label the PR, but you can essentially get like really long and like we were talking about, like funky. Really cool to think about the electrical system, about it in line with tie those all together in your.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, we'll link this diagram down below as well. So alrighty.